to be where, at least for some of us, it gets really, really interesting, because we start to move into the aspects of scale that are a little more unfamiliar to some of you. As we've mentioned over and over again, when you took ACC 601, most of you were really working at the scale 1 level. And we see such a great example in the JUMKED chapter of that growth process of the enrollees who worked at scale 1. And then later in the chapter, we see them move to scale squared, and we'll talk about that. But I also just want to congratulate everyone for making it halfway through the course. Hopefully your second lab assignments are coming along nicely. As a reminder to folks, next week is spring break or catch-up week, depending on where you are in your assignments. If you are not on top of your assignments, you should not look at next week as a break, but as a time to get caught up. And I do want to highlight and remind everybody that fairly promptly after coming back from break, you need to have a draft ready to show your peers and then ready to submit. It's not a lot of time. You only get about 10 days after break to get your submission in, because while we can pause the courses, we cannot pause the rate of change in your community. And so we also would advise you that while you don't have any online coursework, do keep working on your labs even during the break. I think that in my experience, the people who really continue to at least keep one foot into their labs, even on that off week, tend to do much better on this assignment. Turn it over to Rosie. Rosie, I know, has a few housekeeping items, and then she'll pass it over to Daniel, but great to see everybody this morning.
Absolutely. Yeah, good to see you all. I just want to echo Luke in that you really should keep working on your lab assignments, because you'll have next week off, and then we'll come back, we'll meet for our normal class time on Wednesday, where you'll be sharing your lab draft with your classmates, and then it will be due that Sunday. So that if that's starting to freak you out a little bit, I want to let it be known that I will be, even though we won't have class, I will be available, of course, during class time on Wednesday, also during office hours on Monday, and at any other time. So if you have some doubts or just would benefit from talking through what you've got so far, we can have a one-on-one meeting. Please just email me and we'll make it happen. And that we can talk through, especially the scenario planning part of that. If that's a bit confusing, we'll dig into that more when we resume classes. And then finally, just also want to give you a heads up that over the next couple of days, we'll be opening up the second half of the course. So you can look ahead and see what else will be expected. But it's this lab and then one final community lab after you've done all your scenario planning and figured out what the best strategy seems to be. Then you'll build out that plan in partnership with your community members of how to make it happen. Any further questions for me?
Grace is asking what the exact due date is on the assignment.
It's the 18th of April. Great. Any other questions? Okay. Well, please reach out to me if you'd like to meet one-on-one, and I'm going to pass it over to Daniel.
Okay, folks. What we're going to do today is to talk about scale squared. But last week we were talking about evidence gathering, and I've got a second session going on last week's class. But you're going to have to wait a couple of weeks now to get it. Okay, so stay enrolled in the class because you've got a good lesson coming up in the second part of the evidence gathering. But this week, we're talking about scale squared. And scale squared, you should be able to see now. Let me say my screen, I can make this a little bit better here. Hold
We
on
can
here.
see square. There you go.
Yeah. Okay, so scale squared. This is where seed scale starts to differ very dramatically from other approaches of scaling up. And when scale squared happens, it is really exciting to be part of it. You really yourself get consumed by the emotions of your community. It isn't that you're leading something, it's that your community is leading you. You get caught up in the energy of the community. That requires that you let go of the compulsion to control. In seed scale, you must be thinking, you must be dancing, you must be totally engaged with your community. But you're not trying to rule them. You're not trying to control them. So the point that I want to emphasize here, let's see, my screens are not advancing. Let me move something here. So I can, pardon me,
The arrow doesn't work in the bottom left-hand corner.
it's working now, I think.
Yep.
Okay. Now get ready, because later in this presentation, I'm going to ask you several questions, and I expect to have good response from all of you. Okay. So the first question that you're going to have to be answering is, what made Nuttingwall a scale squared center? And then after that, we're going to be asking you about China model counties. And I'm going to ask you why numerical expansion grew in China model counties. And after that, we're going to come back to Jumcade. And I'm going to ask you, what are the experimentation examples at Jumcade? And what are the action learning examples at Jumcade? So know that these questions are coming up, and know that I'm going to be waiting for you to give me an answer of help. But let me give you some answers first. Remember the point that we have said so often, the synergy between qualitative and quantitative growth. This is what a scale squared center wants to do. Okay? You're trying to get this engine going inside the community, where improved quality of life brings more people, where more people cause increased experimentation, and increased experimentation brings more life improvements, and increasing quality of life brings more participants. It goes and goes. That's what I said is so exciting. When you get caught up in that, it feels exactly like when you're on a sports team playing football and your team is winning and you're scoring points. I'm sure you've all had that experience in a sporting event. You can have that experience in a community event. When the increasing quality of numbers gets an increasing quality, it's like in sports. Once you start to get points on the scoreboard, you start to play better. Okay. And what's happening in this whole process is that you are finding the internal dynamics. Now, in scale 1, you were growing equality in size, in numbers. That was this ACC 601 course. Now that we're in the taking to scale course, and we're getting into the scale squared aspect, we're getting this energy going inside of a community. By the end of this course, we're going to be talking about scale cubed, of how we use financing policies, financing of the system, policies of your government, and growing knowledge of your community to promote both scale one and scale squared. Notice what we're doing here in scale cubed. This is where we're getting to. We're using financing that's already there. All your communities have some level of financing. You've got to figure out how to use them. All your communities have policies. You've got to figure out to use them. But on knowledge, you're going to grow knowledge through the scale squared process. Okay? And that growing knowledge is allowing you to use the financing that is there and the policies are there. So it's going to be very different in Namibia from it is in Burundi, even though both countries are in Africa. You're still going to get the engine going, but the financing and the policies are different in those two countries. So it's going to come across in a different way. So this is what the taking to scale process is. In scale one, it's the stimulating of community awareness, learning, and energy. That is the process of getting your community going. You're stimulating the people. But when you move to scale squared, then suddenly a whole new dimension comes in, which is that through experimentation, quality is improving. You're running experiments, and quality is, the experiments are making the local quality improve. You're learning how to use your policies that exist. You're learning how to use your government, even if you have an incompetent government. You're, through action learning, you're extending knowledge to your people so that not just you, but all your community is learning. You're strengthening your resource base of who you are. You're strengthening the ability of your community to act together, which is the endpoint of the definition of community. So that by the time you get to scale cubed at the end of this course, what you're doing is you've got the enabling values of your people. They're not my values. I'm off in America, in West Virginia. You're getting the enabling values of your community working. And you're getting the enabling policies of your community working. And those policies that are not enabling, you're not going to overthrow them. You're just going to ignore them and try to change them. And you're getting the financing, whatever your financing is. You're going to make it more enabling so that you create a synthesis at this point of adaptive learning where you're adapting to the community, to the national and regional situation. And through that process, you are extending and truly going to bigger scale. So just a refresher, remember I've got my questions coming. I told you what those questions are. In scale one, you're expanding in size. You're growing. 1, 2, 4. See, we're on a logarithmic curve that's happening here. And what's happening is change is starting to expand. And what is the meaning of this is that you're stimulating community awareness, learning, and energy. The emphasis is on stimulating your community to adopt a new practice. Then in scale squared, the character of the community starts to change. There is a qualitative change in your community. Before it was more. Now it is grow. Communities are adopting ideas. They're adapting them. And the more adeptly they do so, you see, I'm playing a word game here. I'm keeping the ADPT and I'm changing the vowel in the middle. And that's what you're doing. At first it was an O, adopting ideas. And then you're adapting them. You're changing the idea to fit. And then because you're a professional and you're so good at what you do, you're doing it adeptly. Okay, which means more efficiently and effectively. So that's what scale squared is. And what happens through this process is that successes in one community become action learning sites for other communities. And as that energy starts to happen, experiments start to unfold. They unfold naturally. But when you're adept at it, when you have really learned this course and what you will be doing in lab 2 is you're leading experiments so that you have ongoing development that is expanding across the region and nodes of growth are happening. You've all seen spider plants, other plants that put out shoots and start to grow. A bamboo will do that. An aspen forest will do that. Okay, and then from the bottom up, in all these new places, from their own roots, as that type of organic growth is happening. Remember, we're going back, I'm referring back to biological growth. In the beginning of this course, we talked about blueprint growth and explosion approaches. Now we're talking about biological growth process where this spider plant is going out and putting down local roots, or the bamboo, or the aspen grove, depending on what part of the world you live in. There are metaphors everywhere. Okay, so what happens in a scale square is that people go and see ideas. You know, we've had a number of students in this master's degree who've gone to Jumkid and seen what is happening there. It's really exciting. I encourage you to do that. Or you can go to other scale squared centers that are described in the books or in other places. And then you talk to people. You talk to people, not professors. Okay? And then your expectations rise. Your hopes and your vision rise. And what is happening in that process is that this is happening by empowerment. This is happening by energy that is happening inside the system. That's what empowerment means. This is not a training center. This is not a control center. This is not some sort of forced change that's happening from outside. Now, typically, in that process, you do need some help. A scale squared center will not, in my experience, ever happen on its own. It needs leadership. And that leadership is called Melchade, or it's called Matt, or it's called Grace, okay? And most of you need some money because you can't afford to do it on your own. Now, we've had some people who've tried, and they're still alive, but they're having a pretty hard time. I love those master's graduates from our program who are working in some hard, unbelievable place, and they're doing it. But after a time, you need, in a scale squared center, be connected to other scale squared centers. You need to be part of Future.org. Right now, you're part of EDU. You need to be part of the global network. And in that global network, creating what we call sustainable development learning chapters with fellow alumni. And then to and from these sustainable development learning chapters, you can come and go and you can get energized yourself so that you become more effective. Now, we're coming to my questions. I told you they were coming. So I'm turning it over to group input now. What made Nuttingwall a scaled squared center? I need everybody to jump in with the correct answer. Go for it, Erfani. Turn off your mic and speak up. I can't quite see everybody. So I'm going to you're going to have to jump in and speak.
The Narangwal was the center for skill discovery because it was a laboratory for the social change in case of pneumonia.
Right? That's a great beginning. Who's going to help Erfani by giving more details? He gave you the start. Somebody else finished the example. Why did Nuttingwall a scale squared center?
Give it a go. Through the focus on pneumonia, they identified easy and accessible ways for the community to quickly identify if children had pneumonia, which then led to solving other children malnutritions and empowering mothers to take care of their youth. And one thing led to the next. They also cut child mortality in, I think, half.
Right. So you see what is happening here with Erfani's example. You had a qualitative improvement happening with the pneumonia breakthrough. And then with what Matt's talking about, you have a quantitative extension. You have the feedback loop starting to happen in those two examples between qualitative and quantitative. And Gunjan's in this class, and so we're going to expect her to respond here soon because she works in a scale squared center. I happen to know because I visited it. Yeah,
Can
Luke,
I jump?
please.
I want to jump in and help kind of articulate your question. I think let's get at least one more response. That chapter opens up by explaining that Naringwal was that the chapter is about a 2-year experiment on the survival and nutrition of children. So how does that relate to its role as a scale squared center? Think about the functions of scale squared that you've learned thus far. What's this critical point? Because that chapter really opens up by saying, this is a 2-year experiment, folks. So, but what did they do with the experiment then?
They implemented the education piece, like the training, and then their practices were adopted by more, like the women adopted what was learned.
Yeah, were they doing experiments? Another way to think about this way, doing experiments just to prove something? Was that the end goal here? What were they trying to do?
Let's have it go on.
They
Yes.
they found an easy way to diagnose pneumonia by watching how a sick children of pneumonia is identify how they can recognize how a sick child is ill by observing how children breathe. They breathe frequently, and by granting based on that, they find an easy way to diagnose pneumonia.
That's right, Melchede. Herman was also wanting to contribute to this answer. So Herman, over to you, please.
Yes, this for me, Naranjal was experimenting how to stop diarrheas or pneumonias, but with this experimentation, they were decreasing the mortality rate.
Right. So, but what I want to do is to move on to another, but notice several key points have come out here. As Herman mentioned, they went from pneumonia to diarrhea. Okay, so qualitative growth is happening here, not just with pneumonia, but we're moving to other child conditions. And as Herman said, child mortality is decreasing. And that's giving a real benefit to the mothers. Okay, the number one thing that mothers want, which is their children to survive, is happening. So you've all right, I'm going to now switch a little bit here. And so we are now in Naranjal. What are the experimentation examples? We've just talked about this. And what are the action learning? Let's repeat. Let's have a little bit of repeating here going on. Itemize the two functions of scale squared, experimentation and action learning. Yes, go on, Maher.
Hello, everyone. So for the experimentation examples, let's say that they learned how to avoid like all the disease or all the problems. And then they learned how like to improve the lives and to save like children and to decrease the mortality, as Herman said.
Okay, very good. Now let's go to the next one. What made Jumpcade a scale squared center? We were talking about Naranjal. Now let's talk about Jumpcade. Yes, Erfani.
In Jamkhed, when the doctors come to work in this area with women, the women in Jamkhed believe they are part of property of men, and they cannot participate in social activity. Therefore, the doctors try to change their attitude about their role in social activity. They make women group in village, and they come together and talk with women. And after that, the number of women increased from different villages and come together and talk about their needs, not just about their animals or their agriculture, but they talked about their health also.
Okay, now, so what we see is action learning happening in the village, but something else happened in Jumpcade in addition to the village. What is the other part of it that's happening in Jumpcade? The action learning. Herman, you want to say, or Maher, you had your hand up too, I think.
Excuse me.
Somebody want to else talk about the other aspect? Is action learning is happening.
Yeah, can I say?
In another way at Jumpcade.
Yeah.
Go ahead, man.
So, yeah, so for me, for a Jumpcade example, what really I liked and what like I noted is like when the let's say when Raj went back to Jumpcade to tape or to make the records, found out that the groups of like the village health workers, they already started doing like what they are used to do by their own way, and even like they took the bus and using their own money to go to Bahandaradara, and they started like sharing what they learned, and they started like training other people to do the same. So this is like what is making like a JumpCat example for me like very special.
Right. And I might point out that we have you have a classmate in this class with Gunjung who is involved in such an expansion from her original program at Gacharoli to another place. But I want to quickly jump very much away from JumpCade now and talk about the China model counties, because we have got a very different example of scale squared happening. And Luke, you want to jump in here?
I want to go back to JumpKit because it's too good of a learning opportunity around the idea of scale squared. What is the relationship? Did anybody pick up the relationship between the Narangwal experiment and JumpKit? Which came first? Not which one did we read, which one came first in the book, but which one came first in history? The important thing to understand is that Narangwal, and so JumpKit, a lot of the lessons when the Rollies arrived, a lot of what they began, their knowledge base for how to approach the community, what are the lessons learned for the disease, they were building on the experiments of Narangwal. So just as though in the JumpKid chapter we saw that action learning happening with another chapter, it's important to understand that in history, as you read these cases, understand that JumpKid is learned from the Narangwal demonstration, and the Narangwal demonstration learned from our chapter earlier in the term from Jimmy Yen and the Denjiang experiment. So I want to go back to this function. We saw it also with when Rima took the learning in pollen and went to bombing. So in these cases, we have really good examples of one community really learning from the experience and experimentation of another. And I just wanted to highlight that before we move past these two interesting chapters, both in India. It's important to understand how the JumpKid chapter wasn't starting completely without any information. They knew from Narangwal in their heads.
And
Go ahead, Daniel.
Yeah, no, that's very important because as I've just twice referred in this class, we have Gunjun, who's working with Search, which is a program that came after JumpKid.
Yes.
Okay. And so we have an ongoing learning, and the role from the work at Search, which is also a chapter in this book, and Gunjung, I hope it will be sharing later in this class, maybe some of her experience, has created not just national policies on child survival, which it has for India, but it has changed the whole global care practices for neonatal survival. So this is a great place to still talk about scale squared, but to get to China, which is big, okay? And what you have in the China model counties example is going to national scale story. And it's interesting because China is a control-based culture. You all know that, okay? I'll be very blunt. You do not challenge the Communist Party of China. This is not a system that is open for public input. But yet, using scale squared, it was possible to grow an understanding in a situation that was not otherwise open. How did it happen? Let's go talk about the China model counties example, because that shows you the power of experimentation and action learning.
The important example in China is maternal and child health department, which started work from 10 county with about 4 million people, and increased or expand their activity to 400 county with about 160 million people. We have, in this case, three-way partnership, the people and also the government, the Ministry of Public Health, and outside in which was UNICEF. They changed the situation in number, in quantitative, and also in qualitative.
Erfani, that's a superb answer. I'm going to ask one of your classmates now to keep talking what you just said. You described the quantitative growth, and you just ended by saying they changed in quality. Will one of the Erfani's classmates please now describe how the qualitative process changed that allowed that quantitative growth to happen? So one of your classmates, please pick up and talk about the qualitative change that drove the quantitative. These are huge numbers. He's absolutely right. It's a three-way partnership.
Yeah.
But what is the qualitative change that's happening that's causing that to growth?
I think there is a relationship between the quantitative and qualitative. In the stage one, when it started in 1982, the number of money was very high. But when they went to the next and next stage, for example, in 4 stage and also maybe to 5 and 6 stage, the money they spent was come down, but the result was very good.
This is
I
true,
think
but
you're
still talking about the quantitative issue. The quantity, you're just changing the numbers to talk about money now. Before you were talking about numbers of people. What is the quality that's happening in people's lives?
So to help folks think back, since I know you all read this chapter last week, think back to the test question, which I think everyone had very high marks on, that asked you to identify which stages were scale squared. It said not every stage of the project was scale squared. And as Erfani pointed out, often the stages that were scale squared had a little bit of extra money. But they weren't scale squared because they had the money. They were scale squared because they did something. They had an extra function that they focused on. What did at certain stages, where did that additional money go? And what did it help with? Grace, that's a good question. What chapter was that? It's chapter 21.
And we're going to have to move out of this. So Luke, why don't you give the answer here so I can keep going? Because I've got a few more slides to end on time.
Great. Well, the important thing to look at in those stages is that there was additional money. You see the budget allocation, you see the total number of counties. But it also specifically says that there was additional money put into research. and experimentation at those stages. And some of the other stages, they were just copying and numerically scaling out, and they didn't get as good results. But the critical function at these specific stages where the additional money was going into research and evaluating what was making this health work effective. Okay, because that is the critical. Look at each of these slides that Daniel has shown us across our 3 cases. He has divided the question. He asks you one question about what's this all about. And then he's done it 3 times to you now. So you should be seeing a trend where he then says, what are the experimentation examples? What are the action learning examples? Okay, when we say experimentation at scale squared, we are talking about research so that we get evidence. We get verified evidence. Because what do we know about evidence? It's the glue. It's the glue that helps us iterate and qualitatively improve. Daniel, back over to you.
Yeah, and I'll put back to my screen because folks, it gets really interesting here now. Okay, so here we go. Can you see this? Can you give me hand signals?
Yes.
Okay, you can see it. Okay, folks. See this graphic? Most people think success is like this. But really, folks, it's like this. Okay, it is confusing. You're in the real world. Now, when you take the math and you do China model counties, you can show the quantitative growth as was described by Irfani when he said, look at the numbers. It's going from 10 counties to 400 counties, so many millions of people. Or you can show a nice straight graph here on the, pardon me. Whoa, wait. There we go. You can see this quantitative growth here when you measure just one quantity. But when it's in the community, folks, when you're dealing with people's opinions, when you're dealing with politics, when you're dealing with change, it's crazy. Okay? So this is what you're trying to figure out with your experiments, is how to deal with all that craziness. Okay? That's where the experimentation is giving you breakthroughs, because now we get to what is most important. Now, if you work for the health ministry, maybe you want to see a straight line in its health. But in seed scale, you're working for the community. And what the community cares about is opportunity for all. What you're trying to do is to grow cooperation. The more you can grow cooperation, you're combining the energy of peoples. So that the way you deal with this complexity here and this confusion and make it goes forward is by all people and all quality of life. That through that engagement, through that inclusion, what happens is that you get the whole community working together. Working together means all the energies of the community align. And driving this process of change is that energy. Now you need some money. You need the money, as Luke said, to do the research. You need the money in order to pay your salary. Okay? We want you to be a professional. A professional means you're being paid some money. We're not asking you to work as a volunteer. But what you're growing is partnerships where all are included and where benefits are multiple. And so through that line, remember this line back here, it is actually a journey. That line is a journey. And what it is not health that's growing. It's the idea and the experience of always developing. No community in the world is underdeveloped. Every community everywhere has done the best job it could with what it had. Don't ever blame a community for trying hard, because everybody is trying hard because their lives depend on it. They're not stupid. They just didn't have the knowledge they needed to do better. And your opportunity through Scale Squared is to create an experience inside the community so that it can do better. And as objectives are achieved and goals are tackled and more ambitious objectives are taken on, that you are engaging the forces of globalization. Now, my brothers and sisters in this class, we have just experienced the biggest force of globalization in recent human history with the pandemic. A terrible force has gone around the world. It has changed everybody's lives. That is globalization. But we can grow another force of globalization that allows communities to take ownership of their own direction. That's what you can do with a Scale Squared process. You can give ownership of the direction. Just giving ownership will cause frustration. You've got to move the situation forward. And so what I'm suggesting that you can do here with Scale Squared is to create this experience in the modern anxiety of the pandemic and failed governments and limited monies. And from that engagement, you can start to go on this learning journey. So with that, we still have a few minutes for discussion. We just had a contribution in the chat. I missed it from as I was talking from my notes. What was that? It looked pretty irrelevant. Luke, I'll turn it back to you.
Sure. Well, Albert has asked a good question, which he says, well, when I look at the second graphic, the confusion, it seems to show that confusion most of the time, and representing community doesn't have a clear direction. Albert, that's a great question, because by and large, the community does have a clear direction. It's just that it looks a little bit different to everybody. And so we know when we use a broad term like quality of life improving, that is a clear direction that everybody has. Nobody wants their life to get worse. I think that's probably a universal statement. But it is confusing for a community to figure out how to get there. And it takes experimentation. It takes action learning. And I want to talk a little bit with just the time here to think about the acronym of Scale Squared. What does the SCALE acronym mean at this level? We just saw a diagram earlier in the course where Daniel showed all the definitions of scale at once. But Scale Squared, the acronym stands for Self-Help Centers for Action, Learning, and Experimentation. So the most important thing I can say on this is when we say self-help center, we are not talking about a building. We are not talking about a place. We are talking about a collection of people that are function not within the confines of, say, a building, but you are talking about a cluster, a community that is intentionally learning. It is intentionally experimenting and creating action learning for itself. It is regional, it is specific communities that have some intentionality about collecting evidence that help other communities learn how to iterate. We talk about this criteria. Okay, self-help centers don't do it just to teach others, but in doing it for themselves, they are able to teach others. And the reason certain communities are able to take on this this greater function of teaching, of action learning for other communities, is because they are very intentional in their experimentation and documenting that. And you've heard many, many times in this course that, and also in ACC 601, that in seed scale, we do not use money as the universal resource, and that money plays a fairly insignificant role. Well, at scale squared is the one time where we probably do put a little bit of extra emphasis on going to get some money, because doing good experimentation often requires money and expertise. But it is a critically important function, because going back to what Daniel said, I'm lucky enough, for those of you who don't know, when I'm not teaching, I get to head up our global network. And as Daniel said, I love the way he described it at the beginning of class. I am not leading, I am following these programs. And most of the time, my goal or my job to support those programs is helping them gather good evidence that supports what they already know or feel to be true, but helping them to be able to document it. And that is so critically the role of scale squared, because in order for other people to be able to copy or replicate or adapt your successes, they need to be able to see them and understand them, and understand what processes you went through and how these successes connect to one another. So Dan, I'll turn it back over to you. I just wanted, those are a few notes I was making as we went along.
Well, very helpful and totally important. I want to ask people, do you have any questions? Let's pick
There's
up.
one question Irfani just put in the chat. Is there a logical priority between the scale 1 and scale squared?
No, there is a difference. There's a very important difference, which is in scale 1, you're trying to stimulate the community. And in scale squared, by growing the quality of life through experiments, you're changing the nature of the stimulation. Okay. So you go into a community and you can stimulate them, you can raise awareness. That's what scale 1 means when you take that acronym apart. Raising the awareness and promoting learning. But when you create this idea of self-help, that's inside the community, self-help. You're not doing it from the outside. Stimulating was outside. Okay, so you've moved the change from stimulate, which is from the outside, to self-help, which is on the inside. And you're growing in that process the idea of emergence. I am not going to talk right now about emergence. It's a part of complexity theory. It gets very complicated very fast. And I've talked about it in my other writings and in other lectures. But you've moved from an outside in to a participatory experience inside the community with a self-help center that's doing experimentation and action learning. So it's a big move, Irfani.
And another way to think of it is at scale 1, you are really stimulating energy. You're getting people excited. You're getting them motivated that they can do this for themselves. Scale squared is about enabling them to take charge of that process and learn from those experiences. So you're enabling learning at scale squared. You're stimulating excitement at scale 1.
Thank you.
Well,
Paul, please, what was Paul's question here? In scale 1, yes, go on, Paul. You're on topic. Will you talk, please? You've described it nicely in the chat room, but I want to hear you talk, Paul.
Yes. Hi, everybody. In scale 1, can you hear me?
Yes, go on.
Yeah, I'm saying in scale 1 is like where you get to the community, you mobilize the participation, and then you make them recognize that they can achieve. So that is like mobilization. Like what Luke is saying is like influencing the members of the community. Where in scale 2, that is where now you make the community realize they have the potential to participate, and there comes the running. Thank you.
Absolutely. And Meher, you keep going with this one. Paul has given a correct diagnosis. Meher, please, you talk.
Yes, for me, when we talk about the people in the scale 1, to stimulate them and to make them involved in what we are doing as community. So in scale square, I think they become like partner, or they are supporting us to create the change in the community.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You see how the energy system is changing of the people?
Yes, I agree, because people, they become kind of, they believe in what they are doing and they support this, and they themselves try to encourage other people to bring more human energy there.
Exactly. Exactly. Absolutely right. And your job now, folks, is to make this happen. That's what Lab 2 is all about. Okay? So you've done a nice job of listening and talking now in this class. Guess what? Now comes the hard work of going out and doing it and then reporting it.
Well, thank you everyone for a great class. Thank you, Daniel, for great presentation. It's always, I really love some of those 3 case studies. But we are at time, and we will not see you all next week. Well, not for class. We hope to see some of you in office hours or reach out with questions. We are here to help, and we are not on break. None of the course faculty are in any form of break next week. So feel free to reach out.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you. Goodbye.